Thank you very much. Dobrý den. Greetings, everyone. Ako se máte? I want to thank Georgine for that wonderful introduction, and to Helen and Brian and the rest of the Slovak American Society of Washington, D.C. for inviting me to this speaker series. I also want to give my deepest thanks to the Slovak Embassy and its staff for allowing us to use this wonderful space for this event. And it is an honor to be here and in person. My name is Edward Snajdr, and I'm a professor of anthropology, as Georgine mentioned, and I learned Slovak at the University of Pittsburgh while in graduate school. The late Martin Votruba was my professor, and I want to acknowledge his teaching and his mentoring and his memory. I also want to acknowledge all of the funders, all of the funders of the work that I present today. Having sources to support scholarly work is so important, especially now in this uncertain world. I was able to visit Bratislava for the first time as a graduate student in 1993 with support from the Thomas Kukuczka Memorial Award. Thomas Kukuczka was a journalist with the Pittsburgh Press who died prematurely in 1988. And his family set aside a fund so that students like me, in his memory, could travel and study. And I honor his life and his work through my work here. I also want to acknowledge the Foreign Language Area Studies Fellowship Program funded by the U.S. Department of Education, which supported my language training at the University of Pittsburgh. Federal funding for foreign language learning is vital to our nation, and we should support it any way we can. My long-term fieldwork in Slovakia was funded by the National Science Foundation, the Fulbright IIE Foundation, and the International Research and Exchanges Board. And my thanks go out to all of those critical support programs. In my first talk, which was only on Zoom in the spring of 2021, I recounted how Slovakia's nature protection movement emerged from humble beginnings in the 1980s. And I want to briefly recap where I left off. You know, the regime actually allowed an independent volunteer organization, a conservation union, the Slovenský zväz ochrancov prírody a krajiny. In English, that's the Slovak Union of Nature and Landscape Protectors. And some of its members began to focus on the preservation of drevenica, or traditional wooden architecture from the past, and the conservation of Slovakia's natural spaces. As the momentum of this group grew and attracted members from different parts of society, these conservationists, or ochranári in Slovak, began to bravely challenge a regime bent on extracting and polluting with little regard for the health and well-being and the safety of its citizens. So in 1987, they published a daring samizdat, or self-published report, called Bratislava nahlas, or Bratislava aloud, or loudly. This document vividly and systematically exposed the dismal state of the environment under socialism. Conservationists, of course, were not the only challengers of the regime, as David Dollinger's work with the Secret Church and Marty Mullen's history of trade unions and student activism in Eastern Slovakia and Košice show us. But the Conservation Union provided a pointed critique of communism that most people could get behind. All right. So at the same time that Václav Havel spoke to hundreds of thousands in Prague's Wenceslas Square in November of 1989, Jan Budaj, an author of Bratislava nahlas and a prominent member of the Slovak Conservation Union, joined the actor Milan Knažko on the main stage in Bratislava at the start of the Velvet Revolution. Mass public demonstrations at this time were not just in Prague, and Slovakia's turnout was just as dramatic. And Budaj and Knažko went on to lead negotiations with the rapidly collapsing regime. The Slovak Conservation Union's modest Bratislava office, where they had planned their volunteer work, served as the first central headquarters of the civic union, Verejnosť proti násiliu, or Public Against Violence. It's Slovakia's counterpart to the Czech Civic Forum, led by Havel. These movements together wrested power peacefully from the communists in the Velvet Revolution. So the first half of my book, Nature Protests, The End of Ecology in Slovakia, is a study in the power of volunteerism and a love for traditional culture and historical identity to challenge oppression and tyranny. It is a story of how science can overcome propaganda, how culture and nature together can fight against blind progress. And I think these lessons are, of course, important for us today. But for the second part of my talk, I want to describe what happened to this green movement in the transition. And I believe that we can learn something from this story as well. But before I do, let me say a couple of preliminary remarks. As I mentioned, I'm a cultural anthropologist. I'm a trained ethnographer, and I also had training in area studies of Eastern Europe and Russia. Most of my professors at Pitt were Cold War specialists, and they were not able to actually visit or engage with the societies that were part of their research. My generation was one of the first to have a new and open access to what we used to call the Eastern Bloc. And the title of my talk today invokes, on the one hand, Greek mythology, as the term Argonauts suggests an epic quest for knowledge and wealth, the Golden Fleece. And on the other hand, it is actually homage to the pioneering ethnographic work of anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski, who was born and raised not too far away from Slovakia. Like the Melanesian seafarers of the Trobriand Islands that Malinowski studied, the subjects of my research as an anthropologist also try to make their world as much as the world would ultimately shape them. So after the collapse of the regime, it was not surprising that many of the prominent activists in the Conservation Union founded or were founding members of Public Against Violence. At the beginning of 1990, the environment was the most important issue in Slovakia. It was at the top of the very first public independent polls carried out by the Bratislava-based Research Center for Social Problems, led by the sociologist and a union activist, Martin Butora. And Slovak Greens felt that they themselves would play a major role in the democratic changes facing the country. They felt that they could offer Slovakia a third way, a green way into the future. However, things quickly turned out to be a very different story. As I mentioned, after the Velvet Revolution, many key union members saw Public Against Violence as a place to make a difference. And an early victory in this sense came with one of their own conservationists, Petr Kresanik, who was voted the first post-regime mayor or primator of Bratislava. Kresanik was an architect who championed the preservation of traditional architecture in the face of a regime that wanted to destroy anachronistic national culture. On the national level, however, Public Against Violence and Civic Forum as well started to shift ecological issues to a marginal position in their platforms as transition problems such as economic reform took center stage. Many union activists told me they were quite surprised how some so devoted to conservationism quickly abandoned their pre-revolution cause. But there were still a lot of Ochranari who stayed committed to ecology as a central issue. One of them is this individual here, Juraj Podoba, an ethnologist at the Academy of Sciences. He helped form Slovakia's first Green Party. Strana Zelených, the Green Party of Slovakia, looked to ecology parties in Western Europe for guidance and platforms, and many were quick to help them out and provide them. But in the post-revolutionary realm of parliamentary politics, the new Green Party was merely one of 60 new political parties. And like so many other political endeavors, it got quickly mixed up in the identity politics of the coming Czechoslovak split. Geographer Mikuláš Huba, who had been president of the Conservation Union in 1989, and under whose leadership the group encouraged a lot of dissidents, was asked to run as a member of the Green Party, and he agreed, and he won, became a minister of parliament. But in the spirit of inclusivity, Huba had been a supporter of the Czechoslovak Federation and partnership, and many rank and file members supported Slovak independence from the Czechs. Do sveta, to join the world, is the slogan appeared here on this urban graffiti back then. To Slovaks, this meant taking things slow. And they were uncertain not only about capitalism as a fair system, but that joining the world meant being free from Prague's control in the new political arena. And this idea of Prague-centrism, as you may well know, has been a long and drawn out issue in the story of Slovakia. Equally disruptive, though, was how the new country was to reckon with regime collaborators, and the solution was lustracja, or lustration. The lustration law essentially barred admitted collaborators from public office for 5 years. One of the policy's first victims was Jan Budaj. Budaj claimed he had been put in the secret police files after being allowed to travel to the West in the 1980s. Such an experience is indicative of the dilemmas of living in a totalitarian system. To experience any freedom, one had to officially conform to the system itself. And Budaj had to step out of politics, and he dismantled the momentum of public against violence. Several of his former fellow activists, who I interviewed, supported him, but many remained extremely bitter and actually suspicious about his actions in the past, regardless of whatever the truth was. So as public against violence faded, the Green Party kept splitting into smaller, increasingly irrelevant nationalist-oriented factions. What had happened to those who remained in the Conservation Union was even worse. At the beginning of the 1990s, union activists badly wanted to collaborate with the green movements internationally, beyond their borders, like in Austria and in Hungary. Hungary's robust ecology movement, led by the Danube Circle, or Dunakor, had inspired residents of Budapest to protest their regime in the late 1980s. And they had been able to shut down one half of the communist-era mega scheme, planned since 1977, called the Gabčíkovo-Náš Dam Project. Slovak union members were inspired by Dunakor and wanted to halt the Slovak side of the scheme. So in July of 1990, they embarked on a series of demonstrations to raise awareness of the project's dangers to the local ecosystem. Here they are holding hands across this barrier. And here's some canoeing activists with a sign that says Gabčíkovo is a monument of Stalinism. And they partnered with Austrian activists to chain themselves to a pumping station in the construction area. It really was the first direct action of environmental protest in Slovakia. This is 1990. It did not go well. Police forcibly removed the protesters and took them away. In response to the action, Julius Binder and other project managers in the government doubled down on their promotion of the dam as a place of national pilgrimage. And of course, anyone who protested against it in those days lost a lot of support in the eyes of the public. When I arrived in Bratislava in 1993, one of the first cultural excursions on my language program's itinerary was a boat tour of the new diversion channel for Slovakia's new dam on the Danube. So ultimately, the power plant was finished in 1996. So the Greens were never able to stop construction of this. This is me with a bunch of students, also from I think a high school who were a Slovak high school who were taking a field trip down this wonderful water on the Danube. As 1993 dawned and Slovakia and the Czech Republic separated into two independent states, ecology came in last in opinion polls, far below social security, unemployment, rising crime, or the fear of rising crime and ethnic conflict. Vladimir Mečiar was prime minister, and his movement for a democratic Slovakia dominated the national political scene. And so did Slovak nationalism, and so did nationalist movements throughout Eastern Europe in general. And it was at this time and in this environment that I started my field research. But what was this society like during the early period of the transition? And one thing was clear was that nothing was really clear. As the old world of communism was falling away, the new world of democracy and capitalism was changing places at lightning speed, and everything was opened up. But in that opening up, it was completely unsettling. Informants told me of the silent and gaping faces of Slovaks, thousands of them, who passed across the border into nearby Heinburg. Actually, you can walk there from Petržalka in Austria, as they walked among store shelves of local shops loaded with consumer goods. There wasn't a sound to be made. Kmart arrived As Sarah Hinlicky Wilson noted in another great talk with this society in her book, I Am a Brave Bridge, which was last year, Kmart employees in the newly arrived department store and supermarket in downtown Bratislava wore colorful "Sme tu pre vas" buttons. We are here for you, in this new kind of service approach. And this new culture was such a stark contrast with the scarcity and drabness of the old state-run grocery. And of course, new Mercedes and Audis and BMWs and Land Rovers filled with, guess who, Austrians, began to roar past sputtering Škodas and Trabants on the streets of Bratislava, for short cross-border, same-day, cheap shopping trips. Freedom did not mean security. In fact, a lot of people were extremely anxious about everything that was going on. You began to see nostalgia for the old regime very quickly, right after the revolution, within a couple of years after its collapse. Here is a sign that reads, "Freedom came from the East" at a May Day celebration of older Slovaks in Bratislava. And when the split came in 1993, the money changed, which caused even more anxiety. Everyone had to change their cash at a certain deadline. I was given new Slovak crowns by my language program. When I would pay for dinner out with the new money, the waiter would bring me Czechoslovak crowns for change. And I would say, "Hey, this is old money, stary peniaze." And he said, "Please," the waiter would tell me, "it is all I have and I cannot get it changed." "You're American, can't you afford it?" It was in this context of incredible change and hopefulness that I came to know a new generation of young activists emerging to take up the mantle of environmentalism from the older generation. I went on a second trip down the Danube to view the Gabčíkovo miracle as part of Fulbright Slovakia's orientation week in the summer of 1994. And it was on this trip that I met this gentleman, Rasto Prochaska, and his camera. Rasto was a high school student and a founding member of Greenpeace Slovakia. Greenpeace Slovakia's primary goal was to stop the construction of the country's newest nuclear power plant at Mochovce. You can hear the ghost of Chernobyl in this right away. With financing from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, it would join Jaslovská Bohunica, which was an active nuclear plant, in providing the new republic with its much-needed energy source. But Mochovce's safety system, like Bohunica's, was from the Chernobyl generation of reactors, and many argued it was dangerous. I learned from Rasto that Greenpeace Slovakia's first big action happened just before I got into the country. The group, along with members of Austria's Global 2000, hung a giant banner on the cooling towers of the Mochovce site. While the press was really negative, some called it an act of terrorism. It actually made the front page of a lot of papers. Through networking with Rasto, I met other activists from Greenpeace, and I learned that many of them were still in high school. They had been attracted to the organization through its dramatic promotional materials, which included gripping video of direct action tactics, like blocking bulldozers and riding in small powerboats to intercept illegal fishing vessels. And it was through this group I came to learn of other organizations, many of which were just a year old and just been founded, like Deti Zema, whose members are actually depicted here. Sloboda Zviera, Freedom for Animals. These groups were all headed by young, charismatic leaders. Barely in their 20s, they performed spectacular demonstrations, such as protesting fur coats, still quite popular in Slovak society, and the sale of newly available products like Gillette razors, because the corporation tested these items on animals. Here, activists walk down the main tram line in downtown Bratislava in '94, and they say they would rather go naked than wear fur. Note the Pepsi ad in the building in the background, a new site of the West's presence in the landscapes and the city. The Marlboro cigarette umbrellas had not yet appeared. In one action, young children dressed as rabbits were slaughtered on Bratislava's SNP Square by a large cardboard Gillette razor. As a shower of blood, which was actually red paper confetti, rained dramatically down on the victims. The average age of the rabbits was 11. Unlike their predecessors, this new generation of activism, many of the participants were still in grade school during the Velvet Revolution. They exhibited significant differences in their approach to their protests. For example, Young Greens really used the media, the whole range of new weeklies and dailies that appeared on the scene. And they called photographers, and the photographers showed up because they wanted to take pictures. And it effectively increased public awareness about specific issues. Earlier attempts by older conservationists to stay relevant and dialogue with the public in the media was simply quite boring. Articles, op-eds, letters from union members, Green Party deputies, and new organizations filled a weekly insert in the newspaper Praca. It was called Zelene Slovensko, which is Green Slovakia. But this information got quickly lost in the post-socialist news kiosk, which was being filled with all kinds of new dailies, periodicals, and other magazines. Young activists took a different approach. In my media survey of several major Slovak dailies throughout the year 1995, I discovered that stories focused on environmental issues not only appeared about twice a week, but were pretty much the work of these young groups, like Deti Zema. Their visible actions in public places not only raised awareness among passers-by, but more importantly, it got front page coverage. Two Greenpeace activists, Euro and Rizzo, then founded a new organization, Zama Kuzem, from Mother Earth. And Zama Kuzem wanted to take public protests into their own hands, do things more independently, go beyond the directives of international green umbrella groups. They organized a petition banner depicted here. It actually stretched from Vienna to Bratislava, and then everybody gathered in one of the squares in Bratislava for a photo op. They hung a giant banner on the S&P bridge. And here's another picture of it, but you can see that they borrowed their materials from Greenpeace, by the way. They boldly showed up in front of the German consulate with a banner saying, "Hands off" in German and in Slovak. And they actually traveled to London to join other environmental groups to protest the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development at its headquarters and to go after the source. These new activists in this generation began to combine forces like their predecessors had under socialism, but in order to fight very different causes. A new anarchist group called Free Alternative, led by another young high school activist, Juraj Hipš, helped organize a demonstration against compulsory army service, which all males had to join the military. The protesters marched to the castle and demanded legislators come out and speak to them. And they did. Here, Peter Weiss of the Party of the Democratic Left actually came out and spoke directly to the demonstrators. But of course, there was an attack dog, notice the guy behind him, that was waiting for the protesters behind him as he talked calmly. Sometimes messages got muddled in this era of youth activism and among different currents of Slovak youth culture. When Hipš's Free Alternative put up posters to recruit new members to their anti-fascist group, it featured a quote from an Italian philosopher and semiotician, Umberto Eco. And the quote reads essentially, "I don't see any difference between today's neo-Nazis and Nazis of the previous generation. It's the same hatred for others, and it's the will to destroy." But it featured an image of a skinhead marching, and local kids actually contacted Juraj and thinking that the organization itself was neo-Nazi. And Hipš said, he kind of laughed as he said it, "They misread the poster, and don't those idiots know who Umberto Eco is?" Hipš's Free Alternative group was also very dramatically and publicly engaged in the history of Slovak society in a dialogue with that complicated history. Here, his group performs activist theater in front of the Bratislava Museum that was having an exhibition honoring the life of Dr. Jozef Tiso. As you know, Tiso led the independent Slovak government in the period during Second World War, where it was a protectorate of Nazi Germany. In the demonstration, Hlinka guards stand side by side with SS troops as the victims of Nazism, which is Jews and Gypsies or Roma, lay dead beneath them across the entrance. They were technically not blocking the museum. Museum visitors could get into the building, but they had to step over these performing bodies to enter. When the police arrived after about an hour, they were all arrested, and Rizzo told me to run, which I did. I want to stop here for a moment to make a note about the fieldwork process. In many ways, it was a challenging task because I was trying to do ethnography in real time as a novice field worker. This was my first field project. And at the same time, I was trying to do the work of a good historian, gathering archives and interviewing the right people who had been at important events, obviously, in the past. Often these two things did not match up very well. One of the things I remember vividly is how amazed and somewhat dazed people seemed about everything. Their worlds had changed dramatically. So many things were uncertain. And I remember my own professors at University of Pittsburgh actually had the television on in their office when the Soviet Union was melting away. They did not know what was happening next. No one knew what would replace it. Indications of the possibilities were grim. At this time in Slovakia, there had been war in Yugoslavia. Russia had attacked Chechnya. And I don't really need to mention what's going on now in Ukraine. Post-socialist Europe was truly at this time what anthropologists might term liminal, existing in a condition betwixt and between states of being, where one is no longer who one once was, and yet has not yet become who they will be. And in each liminal state, there is a lot of anxiety and fear. A couple months into my stay, I learned that a fellow Fulbrighter, Doug Gautier, an architect from New York City, was detained by the Slovak police. Everyone in the Fulbright program knew that he was studying conversion architecture, or the repurposing of military structures from the Cold War for new peacetime purposes. But since Doug initially ran into bureaucratic roadblocks and had limited time on the grant, he did the American thing, or maybe he did the New York thing, and he took matters into his own hands. I heard he had been taking photographs of buildings at military installations from a taxi cab along the wire fence perimeter when he was stopped by law enforcement. I didn't know exactly what happened to him. Doug left the program within a couple of weeks, and the Fulbright staffers wouldn't really talk about it. So everybody on the program was a little rattled. The Fulbright staff were also worried about me because I was actively seeking out groups that they knew would get arrested. And some of them were actually labeled officially as enemies of the state under Mečiar's Hazada S. As a Fulbrighter, I was supposed to be a cultural ambassador to the United States, not someone who hangs out with people who get arrested. One beacon of stability in this endeavor were friends that I made through Fulbright. Here is Paul Mago. He's a fellow Fulbrighter, and he's now a political scientist at the University of Memphis on that same Fulbright boat ride down the Gapshikova Dam, down the Danube. And here is Paul with his wife, Patty, who joined him during his research experience. Both of them often provided me with a really good touchstone to be able to hang out with Americans, and they listened to my debriefings quite a bit. And I have to say that having friends from your own society was always a lifesaver while doing this kind of long-term, intensive and immersive field research. And Paul would sometimes come to actions with me, and it always made me feel a little more at ease. Like when he attended the Army service protest, you can see him captured in one of the photos I took. I said, hey, there's Paul. We often compared notes about our research projects over a PIVO afterwards. But I also learned that many of my younger informants at first thought I was a spy, and for whom I really did not know. So to gain trust, I used my camera and photographs. I gave them everything, copies of everything that I took, and they have them to this day. And I told them constantly what I was doing with my field work, no matter if they were older or younger. At the same time, I struggled to balance the here and now with the need to collect data about the past. And it was often really difficult to choose this. For example, getting a good interview with Mikuláš Huba, he was a pretty well-known person and very busy at the Academy of Science. It also meant going to Podšíp in the Malafatras for a week where he had been working on renovating Drevenica with his union friends. And I could only interview him after doing participant observation. In anthropology, that means do what your informants do what the natives do, like cutting new shingles for the roof of a drevenica. Here's an example of the work that he has done. And only after we drank dżięcica, or sheep's milk, fermented at the end of the day. So you could imagine all this, and then finally you get to speak and talk to somebody that you really want to know the history of what they did. And upon returning to the city, I learned that I had missed some important protests with some of these young activists. And, you know, you can't get everything. Eventually, or at the same time, challenging the job of an ethnographer was supposed to be, I was supposed to be immersed in everything, yet my family also wanted to come and visit me because it was an opportunity to see Slovakia, and I don't blame them. Here is my sister, Suzanne. She showed up and agreed to tag along with me while I was attending a demonstration of Children of the Earth on the anniversary of the Chernobyl nuclear accident. And here they are, Dzieci Zema, at the demonstration, the photographs I took. But if my sister, she was a good sport about it, but I had to go to the Tatras that afternoon at the end of the demonstration. And I'm really glad that I did, because I got to go to places where what you're supposed to see when you visit Slovakia. And of course she saw it, and it was a wonderful trip. At the same time, maybe even a couple of weeks later, my father came with an entourage. His friends wanted to visit the old country, and he was on a mission to track relatives down in the small town of Stupava near Bratislava. And actually, we managed to get a rubbing from the grave of his great-grandfather. And this was great. When you go into the cemetery or you talk in the village, well, where can we find so-and-so? But if you notice, we couldn't find other family links on his grandmother's side, and that was the Fatikas and the Slezaks. As no matter how we tried, people around didn't live there anymore. Finally, one very difficult thing about fieldwork was language. I have to say, it is one thing to read Slovak and, of course, you know, speak the usual conversational phrases, but youth culture was full of slang and a lot of non-standard forms, and a lot of profanity, which I'm not going to repeat here. But I want to tell you an account. There are other things in language that language training does not teach you. So, for example, Slovak ethnologist Juraj Podoba, one of my key informants and a great mentor in the field, tried to facilitate interviews when I first got there with old guard activists. Early in the process, he told me that there was going to be a meeting. A new environmental think tank has been created. It's called the Spoločnosť na trvalo a udržateľný život. And I'm like, okay, the Society for Sustainable Living. I mean, that's a mouthful in and of itself. And he wanted me to go to the meeting. So I said, Gdzie bude? And he said, Vimka. And I said, Vimka? Vimka? And puzzled, he got impatient. His brow started to furrow. It's American, don't you know? Imka? He had to write it down on a piece of paper, because I have to tell you, I was very embarrassed, but I also was puzzled because it didn't follow any of my language learning, and not the way Slovaks generally talk about acronyms. And it's certainly not how Americans would say this acronym, but you get the idea. So getting back to the field work, it showed me how a new generation developed in a very different way than their predecessors did. And I'll just show you that what older Greens did was commendable and worked a lot in the structures and elements of the system itself. I call it instrumental activism in the book. And there were pragmatic political attempts to articulate ecological problems, to put forth position papers, to make policy resolutions, and to get legislation. But these sorts of moves are really trying to change society within its existing institutions, which can be frustrating. Younger Greens took a different tack and saw the difficulties of this path. And they used a symbolic approach to capture the attention of the broader public. They represented culture as a society in crisis. Following the anthropologist Mary Douglas, this symbolic activism presented both the environment and society together as matter out of place and in a perilous state. And in a way, Young Greens were continuing in the tradition of the dissident Bratislava Nahlas of that totalitarian period. They were trying to disrupt the order of things. And so in the summer of 1995, I was invited to join Zalmat Kuzem's biggest action thus far. They were to lead a group of international environmental activists across their own country on foot. It was part of the Walk Across Europe for a Nuclear-Free World, which started in Brussels in the spring and was to finish in Moscow in late fall. The basic plan was to lead the international participants through the country, doing about 25 kilometers per day, until the group reached the Ukraine border. Participants would decide by consensus what actions to do along the journey. As the main guide of the Slovak segment of the walk, Rizzo met the group at the Austrian border. And here they are crossing from Austria into Slovakia. And it was Rizzo's idea to ask local mayors if the activists could sleep on the town or the village football pitch or on nearby farmland, which is one of their encampments is depicted here. So the walkers on this journey were from many places, from Belgium, from Holland. Here's two walkers from Finland, from France, from Turkey, from Ukraine, and from Belarus. It was with these activists I visited dozens of villages and towns in Slovakia I otherwise never would have seen. Velký Lapáš, Detva, Zvolen, Hukanec, Banská Štiavnica, Sliač, somebody was talking about Sliač earlier, George, and Michalovce, to name only a few. It was at the Jaslovská Bohunica power plant outside Trnava that activists put up banners along the road. You can see the plant in the background. And then we made our way from there all the way to Levice, where the Michovce site was. We stayed in Levice, of course, and the group wanted desperately to do a direct action at the plant site itself. They wanted to monkey wrench. They wanted a blockade. A lot of West Europeans were used to this kind of direct action protest, but Rizzo would not have it. And he told a Dutch radical activist who wanted to kind of block the workers from even getting to their work site. Rizzo told him, "Our philosophy is to go step by step. We cannot be radical like you in the West. We cannot do eco-sabotage. Walking across town with a banner without permission is radical for us Slovaks." And at the end of the day, the group agreed to protest with banners, to march to the site and simply do a demonstration. But the site was actually quite far from town, so the walk was pretty far. We were all tired by the time we got there. At the plant, of course, private security was waiting for us, and they filmed everything that we did. But Rizzo had made his own calls the night before, and he got one reporter and one photographer from Levice to show up. And sure enough, the next day, we were in the front page of the local newspaper. So Zalmat Kuzem had accomplished its mission. There were no other direct actions the rest of the journey. Instead, the walk across Slovakia made visits to local schools. Activists talked with children about environmental issues and sustainability. And here, a teacher was so excited, she brought her class to meet the walkers, and they all dressed up for the occasion. They were so excited. Here are school kids crowding the walk's support truck named Rampenplan, disaster plan, which is in Dutch. The vehicle had a colorful posters and games and a sustainable kitchen. And of course, many of the school kids wanted to hear the different languages spoken by members of the group. In Michalovce, the mayor of the town met us and gave each activist a piece of local pottery, proudly made in the tradition of the area. After 3 weeks, we reached the Ukraine border at Uzhgorod. Most of the group went onward, but Slovaks did not go. And they had work to do within their own borders. And I traveled back with them to Bratislava as well. I had a lot of interviews still left to do. Through the walk, Slovak activists came to learn about their own country in a very intimate way, who lived there and what their concerns were. I remember Rizzo would go at the end of the day's journey and get to know residents at the local krčma and talk with whomever was there at the tavern. He'd often come back to the tents pretty late at night. The next day, he was always up and looking forward to seeing where the next town was. The number of NGOs in Slovakia after the Velvet Revolution grew steadily each year from 1990 to 1993, where there were 362 new independent organizations in the country. And many of them made environment a top priority. What happened to the older generation? You can see just from data of membership, recorded membership, and this is nationwide, that their numbers really plummeted from 1988, definitely until 1994. As I mentioned, smaller and newer groups would often join each other's protests, and they would amplify their power. And they were gradually making their tactics more aggressive. They were very careful, though, not to go after the Slovak Republic itself, like the nation itself. And I think this is an important thing that they learned. In one action, they chained themselves to the French consulate in Bratislava, protesting France's funding of nuclear projects in Slovakia. Young activists started to show up in different places too, like the village of Slatinka in the center of the country, not far from Zvolen. Slatinka's elderly residents were threatened with eminent domain by the state water company that wanted to flood their village for a new reservoir. The villagers were bussed into Zvolen for a public hearing about impacts and compensation. And when they saw the activists from Zamakuzem and other organizations, they were very worried that they were not going to get their money. They didn't want to have anything to do with this. And Young Greens still had a lot to learn. But in comparison with the work of the union, these Young Greens developed their own form of what I would call samizdat, or do-it-yourself public narratives. And there were ways that really tried to change and challenge the status quo. So after completing my dissertation work, I moved on from my focus on Slovakia, and over the next 20 years, there were other projects that I worked on, including Muslim revitalization in Kazakhstan, domestic violence and law enforcement in Central Asia, and on trafficking and gender violence and activism in Central Asia and in post-conflict Bosnia. And my most recent work, which Georgine mentioned earlier, began about a decade ago on gentrification in Brooklyn, New York, where I live now and where I raise my kids. During all of this time, of course, a lot has happened in Slovakia. The struggle to join the EU and NATO, the ongoing economic transformation, and recent successes in that regard. While my book's title, the subtitle is The End of Ecology, it may seem negative to you, but I don't consider it so. I asked to what end is our concern for nature, and with each end, I believe, is a new beginning. As the anthropologist Clifford Geertz suggests, culture is a system of meaning of our own making. And as we move ever closer to facing a growing global climate crisis, it's critical to see that people themselves can shift the narratives of the world in which they live. And in this sense, the discursive subject of nature in Slovakia remains discursive. And new developments in Slovakia's politics show us how a focus on nature is really an effect of human political will, a will that I am arguing was laid down in these early days, right after the Velvet Revolution, by this young generation. Now, I feel that this fact means there is much hope for the future, despite the seemingly impossible present that we now live in. And as an example, I'm just going to give you a couple of updates on some informants. Juro Krivosik, who was a founder of Zamakuzem, now works as executive director of Seven. It's an energy efficiency center in Prague. And Pavel Shiroki, who was a Zamakuzem activist too, high school student, is now a senior environmental analyst at the Institute of Environmental Policy, and he works at the Ministry of the Environment in Bratislava. Here is Rizzo, who founded Zamakuzem while he was in high school. He is 17 years old in this picture. He is mugging for the camera on the walk across Slovakia. He is emulating the eco-terrorist organization Earth First. A picture of the world is behind him. Rizzo's full name is Juraj Rizman. And not only did he never leave the movement as he grew older, but he recently served as the environmental advisor to Slovakia's current and first female president, Zuzana Čaputová. President Čaputová has been characterized as Slovakia's Aaron Brockovich, who fought against corporate waste disposal in the village of her youth, Pezinok, where she was raised. As a lawyer, she fought the scheme, and she not only convinced Slovakia's High Court to abolish all dumping permits, but the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg agreed with this decision and it resulted in a landmark ruling that articulated environmental rules for all of the European Union. It's pretty significant. Juraj Riesman has thousands of Facebook and Twitter followers, and he advises hundreds of environmental organizations. And he also became President Čaputova's domestic partner. And they themselves have this partnership in this kind of new Slovak political climate. Journalists and other observers are calling Slovakia's new and young leadership a paradigm shift in the politics of Eastern Europe. And Slovakia now stands as a model for other democracies. I hope today that I've provided you with an ethnographic sense of the origins of how Slovakia got to this moment of hope. As Riesman told the Dutch activist over 30 years ago on the walk to Slovakia, we need to go step by step. And that is how Slovakia has traveled, krok za krokom, into a greener future. So thank you very much for listening. Yes, Catherine.
Environmentalists today in Slovakia in 2022, continuing their work of 27 years ago?
Not only do I think it, I know it. And I do think that's a pretty confident thing that one can say at the time. You might notice that nuclear energy was a big issue right there in that post kind of socialist period. But the main concern in Slovakia now is dumping and waste disposal. Energy is, well, actually energy now is probably a very important issue just in light of events with what's going on. But so many inroads have been made in not just making the public aware, but in terms of who the positions of leadership are now getting behind the value of this. And then there's a broader picture of climate change. And this dialogue, this global dialogue, Slovakia is a very prominent voice. Yes, Helen. Oh, I'm sorry, George.
Time frame and years and you mentioned the political steps in the 89, 90, but there was a candlelight demonstration in 88 in March. Even so, it has a religious background. It has a tremendous background of citizenship.
Mm-hmm.
And that was very little resonated by and large because in Czechoslovakia, because what happened in Bratislava was virtually unknown. What happened in Prague, everybody knew about it. So it's an interesting, it was a big movement which the government suppressed by water cannons.
Yes.
And others think the YMCA organization was known in Slovakia right after the war, not so late as you mentioned.
Well, I didn't say that it was new, but I didn't say that it was new, that the way that he was pronouncing YMCA. Yeah.
But you projected the movement of the activists, of the relatively young people who grew up under communism. They just do not have had the technical and scientific know-how except to demonstrate. And what was the next step?
Oh, that's a very good question. Let me first start by saying that the work of David Dullinger, who studied and wrote about the secret church in Slovakia, he is, I definitely recommend you check it out, because Jan Czarnogórsky and other activists who were part of that religious revitalization or that religious dissidence were very important. I think you raise a very important point that Slovakia has not had the type of exposure of the things that happened in that part of Czechoslovakia that were so critical and equally important as things that were happening in this Prague site Václav Havel, everyone knows his name. And this study is a way to kind of rectify that or correct that as a history. But in terms of what, obviously, young activists bring new energy into all kinds of things. They were studying for their bio exams. They were trying to get into university, and they were trying to get credentialed into the regular adult portions of Slovak society. And I have many other examples of activists who still work in the movement, but they do so in professional capacities. In other words, they work for the Ministry of the Environment, they work for international non-governmental organizations, and they also have started their own organizations and fundraise. So they got that technical know-how, along the way, right? So my focus was a little bit on those early days. Yeah.
Had to do with environmental issues. Strictly a political question.
Wait, are you talking about the demonstration by the Free Alternative?
Yeah.
Yes. So the example there is that there were other youth issues that were being engaged with, and so the young activists who were very much part of these new organizations partnered up with some of these anti-fascist or kind of anarchist organizations that wanted to do political theater, political demonstrations, which then Younger Greens sort of emulated. So it was more an example of not necessarily like what was the stance of environmental activists. Those two issues are somewhat separate, but at the same time in youth culture, a lot of students wanted to know more about Slovakia's past and its criticism. Helen, you had a question?
Was very embassy 20 years ago, maybe something along those lines. And my question was, given Slovakia's reliance on Russian gas, what is the thinking now? Are second thoughts being given to nuclear, but from the perspective of giving the technology from the West as opposed to trying to renovate the Russian supply technology?
That's a really wonderful question, because infrastructure was always the problem with activists who were anti-nuclear. Safety systems that were developed elsewhere in more modern systems were available or not being invested in. And so the EBRD was putting in a cheaper version in these kind of new transformations of nuclear energy using old technology. So this was always the argument. It's not that easy to like throw that out there on the, on the cooling tower. But that's a very good question, because the situation now is in flux. What is happening now is posing new, incredibly difficult questions for vulnerable countries reliant on other energy sources. And those obviously are conversations that people are having at higher levels. In terms of activism, I haven't seen anything about that specifically, because it is very much a dilemma, right? Nuclear power is very clean. It also can free you up from so many things. But there are other alternative sources that the green movement has been pushing. But again, they're very difficult to implement and to scale out, to the general public, and expensive. Yes, sir, in the back.
Yeah, since you had your previous Pittsburgh at that, what was the reaction of environmentalists to the United States steel plant?
Interestingly, that process happened. By the way, yeah, U.S. Steel has a very strong presence in Košice, building, plants and investing, and there's a big partnership between the U.S. and Slovakia in that regard. I'm not all that aware from my informants what that story was, and it wasn't necessarily a focus of mine. At the time that was happening, I was in Kazakhstan, and there's all kinds of gas issues going on there, at least at the time. So that's a really good question, but the difference between Western and Eastern Slovakia in terms of activism and in terms of priorities are actually very different places. Slovakia is very diverse. And one of the things that Rizzo really learned when he went all the way to Michalovce and Košice, those places out east, was that he really started to listen to what people's concerns were and found that they had very competing stories, to tell. But yeah, that's a good thing to kind of follow up at some point. I just got a question from Christina Manetti in Seattle. She asks, what she studied environmental activism in Poland, and I'm familiar with some of her work. She says, what do you see as the most important or useful lessons that the American environmental activists of today can learn from the Slovak experience? I think that's a really great question. I almost want to say, what can we all learn from the Slovak experience? It is a very interesting story about being in the middle of something, being in between places, and being in this kind of liminal space, but with so much potential. I think American environmentalism, at least as I understand their relationship with the new Eastern Europe opening up at the time I was in the field, I don't want to say it was arrogant, but it was one where we know everything and you don't know much of anything. So we're going to now give you expertise. Now, on one hand, that was actually needed. As George points out, these are high school kids. But at the same time, there were real scientists and activists and scholars, technicians, conservationists, deep ecologists, people who are writing all kinds of things about the Central European experience, about nature and sustainability. So that was a tense relationship, and people found themselves when they went abroad that there were language barriers. Nobody spoke the language. It was very hard to learn English. So by the time the Rio summit was happening, the representation wasn't really there to be good communicators. So what can the American environmentalists of today? Well, I think they're different than they were back then. But I would say that this idea of having an anthropologist's eye to understand local culture is really, really critical if you want to make any kind of progress, because everybody's lives from a cultural perspective are complicated and different. And that kind of difference is important to acknowledge. Any other questions?
Are the young in Slovakia of today as energized as they seem to be in the slides you were showing?
Yes, even more so. Even more so. What I'm understanding, I'll just give you a case. The old people dressed in their traditional garb going to the Zvolin hearing about Slatinka. It's their village. Their village is still there. The water company has given up. They gave up about 4 or 5 years ago. That is how long they started in 1956. And local activists, students who were in 1994 at the university are now head of the organizations that run the environmental awareness issues and lobbying. And they have a whole host of new generation of students and young people that they are working with. And a victory was just, the Slatinka Association is on the internet. You should check it out. Everybody's young. They look like hipsters. They're multilingual. And they actually prevented a huge disaster, because this valley, the Slatina River Valley, is priceless in terms of its ecological flora and fauna. And they have preserved it. And it was not necessary, this project, to flood an entire, to make a reservoir, right? Water sources are important, that is clear. But how these local decisions are made have to involve local people. So.
I would like to add something. I'm a graduate of Slovak University, but half of it was before the communism, half of it was after the communism. But what happened that, I wrote a book about how in 1948 and after, how the prominent professors of all body of universities were eliminated based on religious, political, and all this. And now suddenly they were replaced by members of the Communist Party who were absolutely unprepared to lead a department or whatever. I give you an example. In Slovakia, the medical school, there was a very famous professor of chemistry at the medical school in Slovakia. His name was Professor Valentin, who was trained in Paris, and he was suggested for Nobel Prize and whatever. He was an outstanding professional. Now, in 1948, 1949, he was simply kicked out and replaced by an engineer who was working in industrial oil. And then he started to teach the stuff and examine the student what the old professor did. And this is not was one case. This was a lot of cases, and not only in medical school, but all over. What I'm trying to say that during communism, the quality of the universities are not the same as qualities in the West or in United States. So today, people who are now 60s, 50s, or 60s have a totally different qualification as here in the United States. I have a friend of mine whose son lives in Vienna, and he has two sons who born in Vienna, Vienna, Austria, who went through all the schools, high school, mature, and so after the high school, senior high school, they applied for medical school through the admission examination. They tried twice. They were kicked. So it's just totally different, the values, the criteria, like the board, specialty board in Slovakia and the specialty board in United States, it's day and night.
Right. So,
That's a tremendous problem. It's one thing that activists come and, young people, they are, and, enthusiastic, but do they have the technical knowledge unless somebody from West supplies it, So it's a tremendous problem,
well, at the time when I was doing work, and a lot of older activists were very aware of that kind of brain issue, the expertise issue, where they weren't necessarily sure how great things were in terms of quality, and oftentimes this kind of volunteerism with these conservationists replaced what would be specialists, and they did take study trips. Jan Budaj, for example, kind of like he went abroad. Mikuláš Huba also had traveled. They had relationships with people through networks. They would get studies and literature, etc., often smuggled in. And the things that they were doing in terms of conservation, in terms of the environment, these things were actually quite new. I think a lot of that has now changed significantly, and just the educational institutions had a lot, going on at that time. And we now are in 2022, and if you think about how much time has gone by, the work that I actually am presenting here are really those roots of that transformation now. And at the time that you're talking about, though, yes, I mean, by all means, you were loyal, or you weren't there. You did not participate, and that kind of a system obviously didn't last. Are there any other questions? Yes, Georgine.
Do you have a Slovak background? Ancestry?
So I do, and as I was showing you not very well, when I started my first talk, I brought my halushki pot on a slide that says made in Czechoslovakia. I still make food in it today, but it was my grandmother's. She was Slovak. My grandfather was Czech, Moravian, and it was her parents who were outside of Stupava. And it was the Slezaks, the Fatikas, that we could not track down. The Tsaknovskis, which was her father, people were scratching their head and saying Zahoraci. You know, they were like, that's not a Slovak name, but yet they spoke and lived in this place for many generations. Yeah, so I do have a background.
So is that part of your impetus?
That's a really good question. When you dig deep into anthropologists and their work, you often find some personal connection in some way. Clifford Geertz, for example, whom I mentioned, did a lot of his research in Indonesia. This obviously was a Dutch colony, and his name has these Dutch roots. But in terms of my desire, really, when the wall came down, I was going into graduate school. And having that opportunity to actually go was very exciting and interesting. And also University of Pittsburgh was a place for that. That was not the only thing that I was trained in studying, but it was very big impetus to move in that direction, to choose a topic, a field site. Chernobyl had been an absolute nightmare and disaster. Eastern Europe was a terrible mess right in that late 1980s. Poland, the burning of brown coal. I mean, just incredible environmental issues that, you know, again, are still kind of with us. And that kind of drove me to some degree there. Yeah.
Do the people that anthropologists refer to were doing their research as informants?
Unfortunately, I was giving a talk for the International Sign Association about with Shauna for our latest book, which looks at storefront signs and linguistic landscapes in multicultural spaces like Brooklyn. And the advice was, oh, please don't call your interviewees informants. They're not going to know what you're talking about. It does sound a little, you know, but it's convention. "30 years later, Shauna has now enlightened me as to why people kept scratching their heads. I would ask them, will you be my informant? Yes. So that is an interesting question, because I have not been back to Slovakia since 1995 when I left. I've been in touch with people there. Of course, Facebook is wonderful because it connects you with everybody that you knew, maybe didn't want to know, you know, and yet other obligations at the time, also raising a family, but doing the presentation. I think now I'm going to reach out more and promote it. When it came out, though, I was already embarking on another project, and trying to juggle these things as an academic with very little time and teaching a lot of courses is actually difficult. But over the years, I have presented on this in American spaces, you know, in Slovak American spaces too. Yes.
And the pride of the young people in their parks, their national parks, the areas around the Tetras, the Gorin Paradise, it just, and then you don't see them. People really invested in preserving the beauty of the area. So I at that time saw a lot of ecology at parks.
Yes.
People cared about how they treated their land.
So I'm very glad that you raised that, because as a national pride issue, this has really come up among a new generation, especially in the 21st century, that those spaces and to preserve these are so critical, because space is limited in Europe, very much so. And other people and other companies can easily come in and change all of that. And so the leadership that's in charge of Slovakia now is very concerned about kind of maintaining that momentum and taking it on. And I'm really glad that you are noticing that that is the experience. Some of the places I walked through on foot, it was just incredible. The forest that you would go through, the valleys, just, oh, it's amazing. Kind of untouched, Was there another question though? Yes, Helen?
I know that a lot of in the name of the progress that pretty tremendous effect on the environment, such as, well, we're going to increase the crops that we grow, and if a little fertilizer is good, a whole lot more, it's going to be a whole lot better.
Right.
Same with pesticides, etc. Are there Slovak sort of hotspots today in the country where things are particularly egregious as a result of communist era legacy?
Yeah, that is a good question. There are still dumping sites that are still in process of being cleaned up, but I'm not exactly familiar with where they are. I know that I wanted to say Trencin was the place, but they're all along that area in the Carpathians, outside of Bratislava, are some not very nice places. Problems from the past. Bratislava itself, Slovnaft, Zlatopieski, some of these places are back then were, I would not go there. But I think a lot of progress has been made. And of course, this new generation has really taken this as a priority in a new way. Exemplary. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much for that very enlightening speech and presentation. And thank you all for coming. Don't forget, our Svati Mikolash party is coming up on December 11th, right here in person. So I hope to see you all there. Look for more information coming out soon. So at that, I'd like to wish you all a great afternoon.